presentación que preparamos es
Well, the
de la
presentation
metodología
that we
para
prepared
analizar
is about
la
the
viabilidad
methodology
de
to
flota
analyze the
eléctrica.
feasibility
Le
of
vamos a ir
the
explicando
electric
en qué
fleet.
consiste viabilidad también.
I will explain what feasibility is.
¿Qué motiva el hecho de estudiar flota eléctrica en general?
What
Es
encourages
que
to study electrical
hay
fleets
más
in
disponibilidad
general?
de
Well,
oferentes de
there
vehículos
is more
eléctricos y de
supply
servicios
of
asociados que podríamos marcar
electric
en lo que
vehicles
se
and services
entiende
associated,
oferta de electromovilidad.
and we can address
Y
that
eso
as
trae
the
consigo de alguna
electromobility
forma de la mano
supply,
la necesidad de
and that
información,
brings with it
tanto
the need of
para políticas
information,
públicas
both
como
for
para,
public
digamos,
policies
privados, podría decirse,
and for
¿cierto?
the
En
private
que
sector, right?
quieran adoptar
That would
flotas
like to
eléctricas,
adopt electric
quieren
fleet. They
operarlas de
want
mejor
to
forma,
operate them in a better
o
way,
también
or
pueden querer generar nuevos modelos
also
de
they
negocio a
want to
partir
generate
de
new business
esta nueva
models
industria que comienza
based
a
on
existir.
this new
Y
industry
esto
that
ha estado
starts to
sucediendo en
operate,
Chile.
and that has been happening
Entonces,
in Chile. So,
en la lógica de la necesidad de
regarding the
información,
need for
la bajada
information,
es el desarrollo de una
what we want
metodología
is to
que
develop a methodology
permita levantar
that would allow
información,
us
datos
to
principalmente, que
have
generen
information
información
data,
relevante
basically, that would
para la toma de
generate
decisiones,
relevant information
ya
for
sea
decision
a
making,
través de políticas
whether this
públicas
is
o decisiones
through
de
public
privados.
policies
Y en estas
or
decisiones
decisions made at the private
está,
level.
por
And
ejemplo,
regarding
el
these
tamaño de una
decisions,
flota,
for example,
por
what
dónde
we
la voy a
have here
operar,
is the size of a
dónde
fleet,
se hace
how am I
de
going
forma
to
conveniente
operate
operar
it, where
y de alguna forma ahí se
will it
va
be convenient to
eh,
operate it,
afianzando el
and
concepto de
in that
viabilidad.
way
¿Perdón?
strengthen feasibility.
Sí.
Sorry, I was told that are you in the Spanish channel? You have to be in the Spanish channel for the interpreters to hear you.
Vamos a...
Mute original audio so that you won't hear the rest. Along those lines, the methodology of information generation is relevant to respond to the need of information. In that project that we're participating, and the head is the Ministry of Energy, in cooperation with Calac, we're working on that methodology. And in addition of generating the methodology itself, we have to generate information and dissemination specifically regarding good practices. So the general methodology that this data collection methodology involves the next steps. First of all, we need to design the experiments. That's where we will be taking the data from. Then we need to implement this, and that has a technical phase. And then those data, those pieces of information, that's data is analyzed. And then information is generated, or conclusions that are based on data. That's what I would call data processing. So regarding the experiment design, which is something very technical, we can visualize this. This is a very technical summary of the methodology. What we have to do is to see the state of the current fleet, the availability of the electrical vehicles, buses, light and heavy duty, and with that, through a technique, determine a sample that can represent the universe that we have available. That universe in every city, it is expected to change throughout time because of a higher capacity. And that's the initial idea that sets the minimum to be considered. And we use that reference to select the size. Well, this is just something free. We can use another author, but the idea is to have a criteria to determine the size of the sample. Then we have to define, and that is always framed on the experiment design, we have to define the variables that are relevant that will shape the feasibility analysis in a certain way. For us, the relevant variables are temperature, and that represents the seasonality, the speed of the vehicle movement, state of charge, especially initially, and the characteristics of the routes in terms of the slope or the distances that they cover in each ride. These four parameters are fundamental, and it has been reported that they do have an influence on the energy performance of the vehicles. So having this information, we do an analysis and we can conclude that there is energy dependency based on those variables, and also that depends on the operation because it's different in the light duty vehicles and in buses. But in one way or another, you can also see the dependency based on the profile of driving, and that is based on speed, for example. So after that, we have the implementation phase. Everything else was design and planning of the study. And the implementation phase is basically how will I acquire the data and how I will transfer them to a place where I can process them. In the light-duty vehicles, we're not only working with GPS Chile, they developed a solution to get the information from the vehicle, the data, and with that, they transfer that data to a database, cloud-based, and we have access to it locally. And once the volume of information grows, the processing cannot be done locally, but in the cloud. But there are a lot of interfaces in terms of how that information is managed, because there are ways in terms of how many variables am I reading for each vehicle. So in practical terms, namely, what we have is that there is a system that reads information from the vehicle and transfer it to a cloud system. And that is what the GPS Chile Fund provides us for light vehicles. And it has a case-by-case process because every brand of vehicle have different communication protocols. And that is something that we have to decode case by case. For the buses, the methodology structurally for implementation is the same. Here we have another telemetry provider, and that's also for the operators of the buses. We receive the data and we get compiled information, and we have to process that information. The big difference when you design the measurement system more deeply is that you have access to modify the data acquisition or to make explicit what variables are more relevant or important. And that's a different case when a vendor is already generating those data. So these are the two perspectives or two options that you have. One is to have data generated by a third party and you just receive them. Or secondly, you as the implementator of the methodology, of the one who is implementing the methodology, can go through all those layers and design the data comprehensively. Well, here we have a summary of how we receive information at GPS Chile, from GPS Chile. So these are databases. We have GPS data and other variables coming from the electric vehicle, like energy, currents, temperature, and voltage. That allows us to calculate the electric power consumed. We also have information regarding positioning, and that can be represented through other platforms. You can understand the root variables like the slope, things that you can process. So, regarding data processing or analysis, We start with the idea that there is a certain sample, right, with a volume of information, and it has a certain frequency for data acquisition. The data gets there, and as any problem with data, they grow over time. So you have to do some data cleansing. You have to detect what are the real rights, where did they stop, when did they stop in a light or for longer, and that defines a concept of a right. And then we process that information. We process that information every week, month, or year. Well, there are different ways to break down that processing. And then conclusions are generated for this processing, where you can understand the dependency regarding the energy performance that the variables that I mentioned before have. For example, the speed, distance, the state of charge initially. Here we have an example of how the information is received. And that is part of what was achieved. And that is the foundations of the methodology that we have. The information looks like this. It has speed and variables based on time, right? So SOC, speed are variables that you read, and that is based on time for every ride. So here we have an example. You are going to have an example of several speed measurements like this, of this type. So in terms of how much energy is being consumed, you can see it here, and that is reported. But if you add information about a fleet with several vehicles and several rides a year, you can have an average. And you can divide information every week or every month. It will depend on the processing capability. But the idea is to reach certain conclusions. Here we have a monthly processing, and every point responds to several rights in a specific moment. And you can see how the performance changes month after month. Here we have a lot of information in every dot because it depends on the driving profiles, the slopes that were covered, but it gives some sort of shape or a way to interpret how the performance is throughout time. This is a light duty vehicle in this case. But this information can be delivered more broken down, and I can have more understanding based on the distance or the state of charge or the average speed. All of these variables have been reported as having an influence in the energy performance. We know that it's not the same thing to go along the same way at different initial SOCs in terms of what you consume in energy for your performance. We also know that the speed or the driving profiles has an influence. Aggressiveness also has an influence. And we are calculating that with an average speed. We're also making analysis of that aggressiveness. Distance also has an influence, but one way or another, it matches the average speed. You would expect that longer distances, right, would have average speeds that are higher, right? Now, we have to understand that, for example, in these cases, what we have are urban vehicles. So longer distances do not necessarily have average speeds that are higher. Nonetheless, it is interesting to see the variability that exists based on the distances and the ranges of average speed. Also, if you aggregate monthly information, you also have the issue of performance or output and the availability that have an impact based on the charge profile. For example, it's not the same to have charges after every ride or having, I don't know, 3 rides and then charging. And that is linked to how I use the battery per ride. So that is something that has an influence on availability. Now, regarding buses or big vehicles, the transportation buses have routes that are more defined, right? And you can see patterns that get repeated over time. They have cycles that are a lot more defined because their routes are well defined, and that's not the same that happens with light duty vehicles like taxis, taxi cabs. So this is an example, right, of buses. You have a record of their speed profile throughout time and how that is reflected in terms of the change of the state of charge throughout time. That type of information is obtained from buses. And also the information that you obtain from reading the data that is delivered by the computer of the vehicle is related to autonomy. It's important to clarify that actually, when you see this, the user can get confused because for the same state of charge, you could have different autonomies afterwards. And that is because every point depends on the previous history. What I mean is it depends on what the driving profile was like, or what was the speed of the discharge rate, what was the aggressiveness for that state of charge. So that also encourages the fact of generating a methodology of good driving practices to reduce the uncertainty that you can see that is reflected in this type of rides. That is information that is shown by the vehicle's computer. And that also shows us, for example, rides in Santiago, and they show that the operator did certain charges or changed the way they charged as days went by, right? And that had certain impacts on performance regarding the kilometers recovered due to the change of the state of charge. So you can see to the right cases that are very bad, 2.82, and very good cases, like 4.1. That is associated to the energy management. What I mean by that is how do I charge or how do I use? So that is information that the user needs to have to make better decisions. So the big conclusions about this methodology is that it's very important to take into account the experiment design. It has to be a sample that reflects the higher diversity as possible of all of these scenarios in the city. And you have to understand that the universe grows throughout time. The idea is that be able to repeat the experiences. That's why the design of the experiment is fundamental. And then also the selection of variables that can be translated in good practices for the users. And the data acquisition and storage system, even if this is a technological interface, it is fundamental because we need to achieve certain regularity in the acquisition of information and the quality of that information. And then the data management system becomes crucial in order to have the right conclusions. And that has to do with communications and also big data at certain levels. And that information is information that the operator can use to modify the fleet management in the future if he acquires information permanently. Data cleansing is also important. We do not only need to have a strong data acquisition system, but the concept of data cleansing, you need somebody with a certain experience, an expert to do this, to achieve a good quality of information. And then generate conclusions with useful information. That is also fundamental. And then the issue of dependency of performance regarding what variables are more relevant for performance. That is extremely important. So that's why the feasibility analysis that we prepare is based on the country's experience, where those variables, those scenarios can be measured one way or another in an accurate way. and they follow certain rules based on temperature, because that has an impact on the performance of the battery. And with that, also, it is related to the sufficiency of the operation of the battery. That also allows us to forecast the operation. If you do a monthly analysis, specifically if you have a period of analysis of 1 year, you can repeat cycles. And you can have, for example, the degrading of the battery or useful life of the buses with this feasibility methodology. Well, the team is composed of all of these people. The project is not only about the methodology, but is also related to degradation analysis, estimation, maintenance, basically good maintenance practices, and it also seeks to generate more conclusions regarding good practices. So this is not only at the operational level, but also other levels. When I say operational, it doesn't only mean driving vehicles, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond managing the charge, and that is also fundamental, both in terms of the availability of the vehicles and their useful life, and generating more benefits. So that's what I had prepared for today.